Hi, everyone. I'm Adrienne Brodeur, the Executive Director of Aspen Words, and welcome to Aspen Summer Words 2020. For those of you who are new to the organization, Aspen Words is a literary nonprofit based in Aspen, Colorado, whose mission it is to encourage writers, inspire readers, and connect people through stories. And we are so grateful to see so many of you here virtually. Once again, on behalf of my colleagues and myself, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge what's going on in the world right now. At Aspen Words, we recognize that systemic racism exists in our society and that we must all play an active role to reveal and dismantle this injustice. Tonight's panel topic, Can I Write About This?, was conceived of months ago, but it is especially relevant during this moment of racial reckoning and a timeless and vital conversation when it comes to thinking about great literature. Once again, welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Carolyn Torrey.
Thanks, Adrienne. Hi, everyone. I'm Carolyn, Managing Director at Aspen Words, and I'll just be going over a few quick housekeeping items before introducing our speakers. So we'll be using the chat feature to post links to the full panelist bios. We'll also try to post links for any books or articles that are mentioned during the conversation. Right now, you'll see a link go up to our virtual bookshelf, which features all of the speakers' books and our Aspen Summer Words faculty books. The panelists will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to audience questions at the end. You can use the Q&A feature, which you'll see in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen to submit questions anytime throughout the conversation, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end. Finally, there's no charge to enjoy any of our virtual Aspen Summer Words panels. We're doing these in place of our usual ticketed events in Aspen, but we do need your support to continue to sustain virtual literary arts programming like this. So if you are in a position to give, we've posted a donation link in the chat, and we much appreciate any donations that you can make. Many of you have already done so. Thank you. We are grateful. And now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. I'll keep it brief as the full bios are linked in the chat. So our moderator is Leah Henderson, author of the young adult novels, The Magic in Changing Your Stars and One Shadow on the Wall. Our panelists are Gregory Pardlo, a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and author of the memoir Air Traffic. We have Lan Samantha Chang, novelist, professor of English, and director of the Iowa Writers Workshop. And finally, Aran Shetterly, author of the narrative nonfiction book, The Americano, Fighting with Castro for Cuba's Freedom. Thank you all for being here to discuss this incredibly timely and timeless topic. And I look forward to the conversation. I'll turn it over to you, Leah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And like they both said, this is such a timely topic. And just to kind of get us started off, I am a writer of children's books. And so in the kidlit writing world, there are often conversations about authentic storytelling and doing no harm, because we are always thinking about the fact that we are framing and impressionable young minds. So in adult spaces, you know, what are the concerns surrounding writing outside of your own experience? And I'm gonna give this one to Samantha. What are some of the main things that kind of crop up in the conversations?
Some of the main things that I've noticed is people have a strong desire to understand the human experience. One way to do that is by looking within yourself. And at a certain point, I think many people want to understand with compassion the experience of others. And this becomes quite complex. It's a complex issue because, as we all know, people have very different experiences of any society based on their position in it, in terms of where they are, what kind of power position they're in vis-a-vis people in other groups. And it's a real act of, it's an exercise of serious writerly compassion to try to sort of inhabit the skin of somebody that's not like you. I've seen people who make a major effort to do this in their work. And then I've also seen writers who are doing it because they're fascinated by a particular culture or gender. But whatever the case, it turns out that the people who read the work have often something to say about it. It's not simply an exercise that a writer completes in order to sort of exercise their own imagination. It becomes a work that others read. And at that point, I think there are a lot of very serious issues, especially in our society today, about whether or not the work presents a picture that the group would have actually, somebody from that group would have actually written about a member of their own group. I mean, it's just it's very interesting to have these conversations. It's so important.
And would anyone else like to add anything to that?
I'd say one of the sort of pitfalls that people often step into is the presumption that we're talking about a one-to-one translation, right? And as Lam's saying, that no one occupies the same relationship to power. And when we're thinking about, so I guess I'm trying to be polite here, but let's just dispense with that and get down to it.
Just get to the,
right? So one of the things that we often hear ourselves say is, I don't care if you're black, white, brown, purple, or blue, but that presumes that all of those social locations have the same relationship to power, right? And so when we're writing about another culture or someone belonging to another identity group, the shortcoming that I see most often is the presumption that the world that this other person, the other, inhabits is the same, is shaped by the same influences that my world is shaped by, right? And so as we're talking about a very profound act of writerly empathy, it's a profound act of writerly. It's right. There's just infinite number of things to take into consideration. How to do it? Last point. Sorry.
Oh, no. Sorry, I thought you were done.
I was. Something popped into my head. I think that if we're writing someone, and the reason that we've chosen that character or voice is to represent a group, then I think we're in bad shape, right? That is another big mistake, big error. No matter who we're talking about, the person we're writing, the voice that we're crafting, has to be an individual human being, right? Cannot be a representative. And I think that's one of the things that we sort of, as I say, most sort of slip into. Yeah.
Totally. And I mean, I think to your point, Gregory, that you have to take the time to learn the history. You have to put in the work to understand the history and the context. I mean, I'm speaking as a nonfiction writer, and at the same time, do the work of study and listening and drawing on empathy and compassion to understand the individual and figure out how to fit those things together. My question always is, can I get it right? Am I up to this? And what do I know? What don't I know? And what can't I know? As I'm trying to figure out how to write about someone. We often say in writing, well, write what you know. But I think any of us would probably agree that the familiar gets unfamiliar pretty quickly, almost no matter what you're writing about. And we have to, that's our job as writers, to push through that, I think, and figure out how to marry, our knowledge with our craft, and represent the people that we want to. I think there's a great Claudia Rankine quote that I want to just quote here. She says, "It's messy and it's going to stay messy because history is not an act of the imagination, which is the condition from which we start." And I think that that is, for me, I have to start there and then go forward.
No, I totally agree. And that segues really nicely into my next question. And so, Gregory, kind of going back to what you were saying, do you believe that people can write outside of their own experience? And before I even give you the moment to answer the question, I did want to say this whole conversation is not about getting permission, right? This whole conversation is not about us telling you or not telling you that you can do something or can't do something. It's about giving you perspectives, talking about our experiences, talking about what we've seen and what we've read, but also it's about then looking at yourself, turning the mirror around, looking at yourself and saying, am I the right person to handle this responsibility? Can I put in the work, like Aran said, to do this? So when I ask you this, Gregory, I'm asking you this with that in mind. Do you think people can write outside of their experiences? And if so, when is that possible to you? What are some of the things that they really need to be doing? Like some concrete things that they need to look within themselves before they do that?
Well, the first thing is to ask why I need to write this character, or why I need to write this story. Right? What is my motive? And I also think that a lot of times the thing that we think others us, or the distinction that we think we have with someone else, is not actually a profound distinction. And there is some adjacent distinction that we're not paying attention to that is more significant. And I'm thinking, just to give you an example of, and I've been thinking a lot about, my daughter switched schools this year. She was in an independent school. She was one of, I think, 3 people of African descent in the entire school. And thinking about why we were at the school, why my family was at that school. And it's not because we were or the distinction that we occupied was not one of race, because we were very much like everyone else at the school, right? And so that when folks looked at us, they would think, oh, isn't this great? We have diversity in our school. But the families of color at the school were all the similar socioeconomic background, were all of a similar education level, right? So there was this false sense of diversity that was being, that people were sort of referring to and patting themselves on the back for. So I think, can people? Yes, and that is, if you know this character, if you know this person as an individual, if you've taken the time to explore the life and not from not simply from a kind of anthropological perspective, right? If you have a sense of frankly love, then I think absolutely one can write, because you're writing an individual. You're not writing. Your goal is not to write
Right.
a history or a people.
Right. Would anyone else like to add to that?
I completely agree with Gregory. It has something to do with one's reason for wanting to write from the point of view of another. And it starts, it starts with the work. It comes from the characters. I also think that it is related to the development and experiences of the writer. When I was to use an example, when I was a young writer, I think I wrote a book in which almost every one of my protagonists was a young Asian American woman. I could feel it coming out of me. I could feel the authenticity and authority in the voice when I wrote that point of view. And I was comfortable writing that point of view. There was a period in that stage when I tried to write from the point of view of a young Asian American man. And I showed it to some readers and they said, who is this person? Does this person ever think about, say, sex or anything? And I thought, I don't think I really know. I don't know how that person feels about sex. I don't know this person very well at all. And so I realized that there were times when I was writing when I could actually feel a connection to the people I was writing about, and that's how I knew I could write about them, that I was able to do it at that point in my development. As I've gotten older, I think it's now 30 years later, I do write about male characters. I've had a lot of different life experiences, and I found, I've met people and come to know them very deeply. And I think that's the difference for me.
I guess a couple things, if I may, Leah, just
Sure.
that I try to keep in mind is that, identity isn't static for an individual, that it's relational, that it's contextual, that it changes. And I think that's to both of your points in terms of not creating someone that's just representational, but understanding that it's almost more of a verb than a noun a lot of the time. And it depends on history, and it depends on what is whiteness without Blackness or Native Americanness or Asianness in this country? I mean, it's meaningless. And the other thing I think that I would say is that everyone is an actor in their own narrative. I mean, for me, like no one doesn't have agency. They have some agency. And if you remove that from them as a character, you're missing out on the depth of what that person could be.
Right, I do agree with that. And I think, oh, did you want to say something, Greg?
Well, I just, can we broach the topic of whiteness since?
Oh, absolutely.
As a teacher of creative writing, what I find is that whiteness is often such a totalizing force, it demands to be the standard, it demands to be the norm to such an extent that it crowds out any other sense of individuality. And so I've had a number of students who have said either explicitly or then certainly plenty implicitly, I'm just a white person, I don't have anything interesting to say. And and this is the harm that white privilege does to white people, right? This is the harm that race does to white people, is that it convinces some, right? This is not a totalizing comment, that the only thing and we also think about identity in these commodified terms, the only saleable, the only marketable characteristic or quality that I have is my whiteness, to the exclusion of regional characteristics, class, obviously, personal history, and everybody, as you say, Aran, and this is what I kind of sparked this idea, that everybody has their own history. And if we, as writers, if we can't see ourselves as fully unique and idiosyncratic characters, then I don't think we have any chance of seeing anybody else in our work in that way.
Good point.
I completely agree. And I think, and it's funny that you say that, because a lot of the times I will have white friends who say to me, when I ask them, why did you decide to write this particular story? Because it's about, some Black person doing X, Y, and Z, or some, Spanish person doing so. And so I'm like, well, why did you decide to write this when you have this wealth of things that are so specifically you? And they kind of look at you like, what are you talking about? Like, no, I don't. This is so fascinating and interesting. And I'm like, I think we need to start here with self and then go on. And so then my next question comes from a Jacqueline Woodson article that was in the Horn book. It's called Who Can Tell My Story? And so Aran, I'm just going to read this little blurb from it, this little part from it. And then I just have a question for you to start off. And it's just really jumping off of this. She says, there is room in the world for all stories and that everyone has one. My hope is that those who write about the tears and the laughter and the language in my grandmother's house have first sat down at the table with us and dipped the bread of their own experiences into our stew. what do you believe are essential things to consider before infusing and layering your stories with experiences different from your own? So this for me is one of those really big ones, because I ask my friends all the time, I'm like, are you writing your experience? Are you writing your truth down before you go to try to tackle somebody else's? You know, because I feel like you were saying, if you don't really know who you are at the essence and at the core, how can you start defining who somebody else is and not be stereotypical or judgmental or whatever? So that's my question to you, Aran. What do you?
I mean, I think it takes a lot of work. I mean, to face your own, be sensitive enough to understand when you're addressing your own biases and reflect on them. I'm working on a book right now that is centered on a horrific event in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1979 that's known as the Greensboro Massacre, which was a multiracial group of labor organizers who were shot by the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazis. And I'm telling the story through an African-American couple that is still active in Greensboro as civil rights activists and have been for over 50 years at this point. And I did ask their permission, in fact. I went down, I sat with them, and I asked them if they would let me spend time with them and write their story. I've spent countless hours with them, but I've just been working on a chapter about a Klansman who was also a police informant. And to be honest with you, this was a far more difficult character for me to deal with than it was to connect with these college-educated, civil rights workers who I've been spending tons of time with. And so I had to really sit down and try to think about the things that I could connect with in him, to write about him not as we've been talking about, just as a cutout, but as a person. And what I ended up finding is I found places to have empathy with this person, with his loneliness or the lack of meaning in his life, or his desire for meaning, let's say. And so I think, it's hard to know where we're going to trip when we're going to write about a character, and then you have to sit with it. And I think one of the most powerful things a writer can say while they're working is, I don't know.
Yeah, I think you start with, I don't know, especially if you're writing outside of your perspective. And even when you're writing about yourself, I think you're like, there's a lot I don't know about me, because I haven't taken down those walls to really explore and be vulnerable and get things wrong. So I completely agree. And then just one thing I do want to say about the permission aspect. So the permission that you were seeking for me is a very different permission. The permission I'm speaking of is the type of permission where when they get things wrong, they come back and say, Leah said that I could write that. That's the type of permission. That's the type of permission I was referring to was, I can do it however I want to do it. I probably won't do as much work as intended, but Leah said I could do it, so I'm going to go do it. That's the type of permission I'm talking about. And I get that. And I'm like, that's not what I said. So, but I do agree that it's always to be mindful of the person's story that you are telling. If there is a person that you could reach out to get the permission, I wholeheartedly agree with that in that respect. But did anybody want to jump in on what Aran just said?
Well, I would love to ask what your interest in the Greensboro Massacre is.
It's interesting. I was at this really neat writers conference last year, the Mayborn Nonfiction Literary Conference in Dallas. And I was sitting listening to all these panels with nonfiction writers. And I kept hearing something that was repeated, which was, I heard this story and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I heard this story and I got a tingle in my arm. Well, what's interesting to me is I almost fell out of my chair when I heard people saying that, because I don't like to talk about the fact that both the books that I have chosen to write started that way. My book about Cuba started with hearing this story and having the hair stand up on the back of my neck. And I knew that it was leading me out of curiosity to want to understand something. I had to then formulate the question, as you're saying, and understand what it is, why it did that, and what it is I wanted to know. In that case, it was really very simple. Often they're simple questions. So for example, in that case, it was, well, why are US-Cuban relations this way? And then what I found was this amazing character to follow into that conversation. I mean, who was an actor in it. And I think, in this Greensboro case, it's why is it so hard to change, our racial, reach deeper equality, deeper democracy, when good people are working so hard. And I think that, I sat in a cafe in Greensboro in 2015, and this man, Reverend Nelson Johnson, told a story about in 1987, I mean, this was part of what hooked me, of driving out into rural North Carolina to have a conversation with the Ku Klux Klan, to ask them not to march in Greensboro, which they were planning to do in 1987. And these were the same men who had killed his union labor organizers. And the hair stood up on the back of my neck. And I said, I have to understand his moral and physical courage. And I want to also understand why this is so hard.
It's in the poetry workshop, my poetry workshops at any rate, I often talk about the nuclear core, the power source that is sort of generating the lyric energy. And my students often want to talk about the content of the poem as if that's what the poem is about. I want to talk about the energy that is moving, that is generating the poem. So we can talk about, for example, the poem about the wrestler who fell from the rafters into the ring in 1999, and this poem is about that wrestler, that professional wrestler, and that horrific story. If I don't recognize, if I don't discover that is an allegory, that is a framework for my own sort of fears of I don't know, make up something to psychoanalyze myself on the spot. But if I don't understand why this construct, why this paradigm, why this story is necessary for me or what it is allowing me to express, right? That is mine. So I don't know. I think that maybe in nonfiction, or I'm being biased now. I'm showing my bias in favor of poetry. that the conversation can reside on a sort of level of content, but as a craft concern, I'm often interested, and I'm always interested in, what is the thing in your childhood that is trying to speak through this sort of metaphor, right? And this allegory, as I call it.
So why is the hair standing up on the back of the neck?
Right.
Yeah. Oh, you want me to try to answer this? Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I'll give it a shot. I mean, but I feel like, I think in a lot of ways, I as a writer, I'm an observer, and I'm really drawn to these people who go into the fray, and want to follow them into the fray, and experience that through them, but that's the way I'm doing it.
If that were my example, I would recognize immediately that I'm drawn to people who go into the fray because my father would constantly go into the fray, right? And understanding that, I don't have to. I'm not going to write I do write about my father quite a bit. Okay, whatever, but I don't have to write about that subject matter over and over again. But I understand what my relationship is to the human, individual element of that story. And so each time I'm telling that story, I'm contextualizing it in some new way.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
I also think it's a lot about finding that emotional core and that heartbeat that translates into all these different spaces. And we do write outside of our own experiences, thinking about that emotional core and then relating that to the subject matter or the person that you are writing about, and then looking at it with their lens on the world. Yeah. And I think that when people do that, when they're ready to do that layer of work and keep going, then they are able to put something on the page that is respectful and authentic in a way that I think a lot of people miss that beat. I think a lot of people forget about that string that connects you and that experience that you think is so unlike yours. I think a lot of the times when I'm teaching, I talk about, the iceberg, and we stay above surface and we don't go below. And there's so much richness below that will inform what's on the top, and we need to get in there. And so that's where the heart is. That's where, that's where our emotional core is. And so when I think about people who are ready to do the work on their end, my next question to you all is, what is the publisher's responsibility in this conversation? Like we've seen some, the first book that's popping in my mind right now is everything that's kind of gone on with American Dirt. And like people being so captivated by this book, but at the same time, the communities that are supposedly represented in this book find it's riddled with issue for them. And so when you look at the publisher in this, what do you believe their role is in making space for other writers to tell their own stories? What do you think their responsibility is when they're acquiring these books by people who are writing outside of the experience? What onus is on them to do some checking to make sure this person is telling an authentic story that's not going to do harm? And I will let anyone chime in, but Samantha, I will start with you, but definitely Aran, chime in, and Greg, chime in, because I'd love to hear what all of you think. Oh, is she there? Is she frozen?
Is Samantha freeze?
I think she did. So while she's getting hers back, would either of you like to? Oh, is she back?
Back.
Okay. Okay. Good.
I missed this amazing conversation. What happened?
Oh, no.
We solved it all. We figured it out. Aran and I, it's all taken care of.
Actually, you're up, Samantha. The question's for you.
What is it?
So the question is really about the publisher's responsibility in this whole thing.
Oh my
goodness. The heavy
That's incredible. I mean, this is so interesting to me. I am not a publishing professional, but I have noticed that a huge number of the people who are responsible for choosing and vetting and gatekeeping tend to be very well-intentioned, but pretty sort of like a pretty homogeneous group of people in terms not only of their cultural background and racial background, but it goes to gender and financial background. It's first of all, publishing has a very low profit margin, so it's hard to live in New York on very little money. So it's hard to be in the publishing industry if you have any financial constraints. That's a huge issue. And then I am thrilled every time one of my students of color decides to work as an editor, and I have my fingers crossed for them.
And so going on that, like, what are some of the other things that you think about when you think about a publisher's responsibility to make room in this conversation? And anyone can chime in here.
Okay.
If something is problematic, what's their responsibility?
It's their responsibility to,
or what should be.
well, I just think it should be their responsibility to understand on a fundamental level, to make every effort possible to understand the importance of a multiplicity of voices, and to question the sort of dominant tropes about various groups in literature, in the history of literature, as well as in our current literature, and even in the media. Someone else?
Yeah, you know what's funny, not funny, haha, but in the last couple of weeks, every organization that I have ever grazed tangentially has reached out to me to ask me to comment, to read their public statement on George Floyd. And, you know, and in a sense, you know, the problem is, okay, so now I am asked to do all this free labor. But on the other hand, of course, I'm happy to do it, and it is absolutely necessary. I'm in a position where I can do it, and so I do it. But this kind of moment where people are aware that I really need to vet this text. I really need somebody else's eyes on this material. I really need a diversity of input, and I'm going to go out. And that's what this moment, the lie that this moment reveals, is that when you're motivated, you can absolutely find diversity. You can absolutely address that issue. But when you feel it, when you feel that pressure, you get pretty resourceful.
No, I totally agree.
Yeah, I mean, to my mind, the publishing industry is an industry that's subsidized at the initial levels of, the entry level. It's really hard to live in New York on $36,000 a year. And the people who can do it don't have student loans and often get help from family. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, but it's going to cut out a whole group of people, to your point earlier about your school and you all being of the same class and same educational background, right? I mean, we're not drawing diversity, real diversity in a way, into the publishing industry when it's organized that way. And it seems to me the only way that we're going to really change this is to rethink how we draw people in and what they're expected to live on. I mean, why go spend 4 years of college with and accumulate debt and then go live on $36,000 or $40,000? I mean, when I was an editorial assistant in New York, I was earning $24,000. I mean, and I could barely do it, but it was barely. Go ahead.
You're younger than I am, because when I was an editorial assistant in New York, it was $11,000 to $15,000 was the going salary for an editorial assistant.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that, and then also advances, I mean, if you're going to try to get a writer started, how do you help them get started? And I think that needs to probably, on the writer side, be looked at a little too.
I think it's interesting that this whole quarantine situation and people having to do all the virtual, just hearing from friends who work at publishing houses that are like, they had all this highfalutin equipment that they never used, and now we're all at home and we're checking in. And so it's now begging the question, why can't you have some of these people from other parts of the country coming into your meetings remotely? You are seeing that, yes, there are some things that cannot be done remotely, but that doesn't mean your staff, once we get back to a situation where we can be in the office, but that doesn't mean that there aren't some people who could definitely maybe come to town a couple of times a year. So I definitely agree that there's a lot of reshaping and rethinking. And so along that line, and just kind of where we are right now with a truly politically divided country and responsibilities and roles, what do you think a writer's role is right now? And what do you hope to see in the books that are coming, you know, that are going to come to the forefront in the next few years, you know, with all that is going on? What do you hope to see?
I hope to see more conversation, more people. I think there's far too much, and I understand where it's coming from, but far too much fear around these conversations. There's far too much discomfort, and I guess it comes out of distrust, right? And so we have to have spaces like this where we can model the kind of security, the kind of camaraderie that allows for risky and vulnerable conversations to take place. And I mean, I'm not satisfied with my own work unless it makes me anxious, unless, you know, if it's not scaring me in some way, then it's not doing the work, right? And so I think these conversations, the risk that is required for exploring the boundaries of not just personal identity, but the collective we. Where do we draw that line of the pronoun we? You know, how do we imagine communities? And so there are ways to explore all of the sort of landmine issues that we experience today in writing that are, I think, can be safely done.
No, I agree. I do agree. I think right now, especially with more awareness for some people, I think it also has me frustrated in ways where I'm like, people have been shouting about this for a really long time, and you're just kind of realizing it. So now I kind of want to see the books that go to 2.0 in the conversation. So if you are ready to listen, not that you completely understand, I understand this, you know, but we need to go beyond this surface of that can't possibly be, and see those stories out there and those conversations. So I think that spaces like this are always wonderful places to start for people when they are not sure, because it is a safe space. And so my question now to you is, Aran, do you find yourself to be a writer of your time, or do you find yourself to be a writer ahead of your time?
I have no idea. Do I dream of a different future? Sure. Am I bounded by my own limits? Absolutely. In this moment, for sure. I don't know. I mean, one thing that I think about a lot, right, is, you know, I spend a lot of time looking backwards and how relevant the past is to the present always, you know, right. And so I don't know if that places me even before the present as opposed to in the future. But I mean, you know, I think that a lot of times we have to move back in order to reach forward. And I think this is one of those times where maybe people are starting to do that a little bit. And, you know, I think people were talking about books to read and, you know, recommendations from us a little bit. And to my mind, if everyone read W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, they would think of American history very differently. And that would probably be a valuable thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And Samantha or Greg?
I've been pondering this question. I would love to be a writer ahead of my time, but I fear that I'm a writer living exactly in this moment. And because I'm in this moment, I'm, you know, filled with emotion and trouble and excitement and a sense that it must be possible, that we must make it possible for this world to change. I feel that as a writer, I have a responsibility in that way. Because my process is mind-blowingly slow, I assume I'll be a writer 7 years behind my time. But I'm vowing to do everything I can to examine my work and think very hard about it.
Okay. And for you,
I respect the fact that there are poets and writers who want to speak to the zeitgeist, right? We need those writers to tell it, to reflect who we are, to tell us who we are, give us a sense of, you know, the dimensions of our character. But my good friend Rowan Ricardo Phillips, who is a denizen of Aspen Words, always says, he writes, and I hope to be like him, the long game is the only game, right? He wants to write, and I like to think I write for a future that I will never see.
right.
I will never live to see, that is, right? And because it's our job, it's the poet's job, certainly, to imagine the world as it could be, right? And to contribute to our society ways of thinking about the world that open up and create new possibilities.
Absolutely.
So I don't know about time, but it's certainly a commitment that that has a kind of, as Rowan says, a kind of epic character.
No, I totally agree. So I know we only have a few more minutes, and so I know Caroline is going to come on to do questions from the audience. So I want to make sure we leave time for people to ask their questions. There you go.
Thanks, Leah. Thank you all for such a wonderful conversation. And as Leah said, for creating the space to have it with us, and hopefully it's not the last. We have almost 200 people here, so lots of questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. I'm going to start with one that came in referencing something Aran said at the beginning about asking yourself, what do I know? What don't I know? What can I know? And the question from the audience was, what can't you know when you're writing? What are the things you just can't know? So maybe Aran, you can start, and then others can.
Well, remember, I'm writing nonfiction, so and I'm not sure. That would be an interesting conversation to see how that differs or doesn't differ when you're making a character in a poem or a memoir or a fiction book. But there are going to be choices that people make, decisions that get made at both individual and institutional levels that are shrouded in mystery at times, that I can't know the answer to, and I have to fill in the gaps. And that is one of the, or figure out how to account for what I don't know in the narrative and make that either, and be honest about that. And I think that, you know, I have to imagine my way into the possibilities, but I can't represent my imagination fully on the page if I'm going to write nonfiction. So I can create atmosphere, but I can't necessarily give an answer. Let me see. Here, I'll give a specific example. And this is sort of esoteric, but right after about a year after the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro ordered a shipment of arms that was delivered to Havana, and the ship blew up in Havana Harbor and killed hundreds of people, 70-some people, injured another couple hundred. And he immediately said the United States had sabotaged the ship. The United States said, "What are you talking about? We didn't sabotage the ship." And 2 weeks later, Dwight Eisenhower signed secret papers that became known later to officially advocate overthrowing Castro? I don't know. I've never been able to solve that mystery, but I have to represent that mystery.
That's the moral castle, right?
Mm. Yeah, right near the moral castle. Yeah.
For me, I ask myself, what cultural assumptions are baked into the decision I am making, the craft choice that I'm making right now? And no, I can't figure out all of the cultural assumptions, but just making myself aware, because it's the job of cultural assumptions to be invisible, to be transparent, right? And so I want to be in the practice of making my assumptions visible, legible to myself. And so once I start to kind of list or inventory the cultural assumptions that are informing my choice, I can begin to ask, well, what am I not looking at when I'm looking at this, right? So this choice is at the expense of what? And, you know, of course, as we're saying, there's no way I'm going to know the infinite range of other possibilities, but I can I can add more texture to my work by thinking about what these choices come at the expense of, and do I really choose this thing instead of this other thing, right? And I think so often we'll just write on automatic pilot, not challenging, not questioning our cultural assumptions, and then being frustrated that we can't see anything more, I can't see any more where to go with this draft, right? And so that's one strategy that I have.
For me, so my first novel is set in Senegal, and I am not Senegalese. And one of the main things, to Greg's point, is that the assumptions that I was bringing to the table and kind of discarding them and really being aware that I do not know what I do not know. And there is plenty that I do not know. And I know I'm working within this frame of what I think I see. But all that stuff outside the frame is what I need to go find. I need to go dig into. I need to go investigate, and I need to get lost in. And I need to get lost in it in a way where I'm not trying to justify what I'm seeing. I am just pulling it in. I'm pulling it all in, and I'm trying to put it in places where I can, you know, touch it, where I can figure out what it really is. But I think for the whole process of me writing, it's called One Shadow on the Wall. For the whole process of me writing that book, I literally at every stage was like, you don't know what you're talking about. And being okay with that, and knowing that I was going to make lots of mistakes, and knowing that I was an outsider in this space, and that I needed to get to a place where I was welcomed into somebody's home as a guest. And until I got to that place, which took me 10 years to get to, I was just, what's outside the frame? What do I just need to pull and pull and pick and pull? And when it's meant to kind of form itself where it's supposed to be, I think that's when I realized that my assumptions were getting cast aside for that moment. So that's something when I think about what you don't know, you're never going to know what you don't know, but you will find things out. And so that's how I looked at it with my work.
Yes, I completely agree with this sense that I won't know what I don't know, but I'll never know it. I will never know what it's like to be a human being in a body different from mine. I won't. But I can read work by people, you know, great writers who are not in my body, and I can try to reach out and understand. I can try as hard as I can through my reading to know something, to know what it is that what I hadn't expected, to try to understand what makes up a consciousness. I think this is the primary task and biggest challenge of fiction writers. And until we can accept it as our sort of responsibility, our greatest work, I just think that that we'll be missing some of the point in why we are doing what we do. Yeah, it's been very, very enlightening today and really wonderful to be part of this conversation, and to even have a situation in which we can talk frankly and think about these things.
Yeah, likewise.
Thank you all. This next question is a good one for teachers or people reading others' work. So it is, when you see a student or writer venture to tell a story outside of their own experience, how do you approach the conversation when there is evidence of a lack of research, lack of nuance, lack of self-investigation? How do you tell someone that? Let's start with, why don't you start, Samantha, as our Iowa Writers Workshop director?
I mean, I'm often fortunate to not have to be the one to start the conversation, because when somebody's work isn't sort of compassionately drawn, when the material isn't thought through and felt through, I think it's pretty clear to a lot of the people in the room. And often my job is to moderate a very... Oh no.
She might have just cut off.
Oh.
Does someone else want to jump in and then she can restart?
Well, I think where I was connecting to what she's saying is that my job as a teacher in the workshop is to moderate the conversation. And so what I want to do is make sure that we're actually talking about the text, and well, I want to have some balance for respecting, everyone's sort of cultural perspective. But I also want it to be, I see everything as a teachable moment. I also want it to be an opportunity to say, well, let's look at the page. What is happening on the page that is not working? Why is this not working? Right, and I think my fear is that in those moments we too often kind of freeze up out of fear of the outrage and the sort of cancel type of reaction, and so that keeping the conversation moving is really important.
I think for me, and this might be because I'm in a kid lit space, and so the work that I'm reading is for children. And so my first and foremost for me is do no harm to the child when they pick that book up. I do not want a child picking up something that is supposed to represent who they are, or they think that it is going to represent who they are. And it hurts. And those are hurts that don't necessarily go away in adulthood, right? So they are really shaping some things. So when I have students who have something that's a little bit problematic, kind of like Samantha was saying, people in the group, other students are chiming in on certain aspects of it, but also I like to take it back to just craft in terms of voice and talk about the lens on the world that you are telling the story. And is that truly how they would see this situation? And is that truly how they would engage with whatever the situation might be? And I think that when you start there and say, you have to take yourself out of it, this is not your voice. This is someone else's voice. And are you being true to that voice? Or are you putting some of your biases or some of your thoughts or some of the assumptions that you make into their voice? Because if you want a strong voice, that's not what you're meant to do. And so I start at the craft level and then kind of gauge what the room is willing to chime in on as well. And then we go from there.
Yeah. I just to emphasize, I'm always interested in that second shoe dropping, and that is, why do you need this voice? Why did you go there in the first place, right? So we get that it's done sort of ham-fistedly, but what is the purpose that you're trying to serve? And that's often a really enlightening conversation too.
Yes.
That's great. I think this will be our final question. We'll try to do it pretty quickly to wrap up in time. And this one goes a little bit back to what Leah was just saying. The question is, I work at a literacy project in the Mission in San Francisco. Teachers routinely assign the students we work with to write stories and poems about fictional characters whose identities and cultures are different from their own. I know that when I write fiction, I like to do the same. How does this square with the current emphasis on own voices in the world of adult literary and children's fiction? Do you want to start, Leah, as our...
I don't mind starting. I think the question gives me pause in a way that, why are we starting with writing outside of our perspective? And I just, because I think if you are telling somebody to do something, right, and it's not coming from that heart place, or that curiosity place on that general level, I think that's where you run into a lot of assumptions and a lot of trouble. So the fact that it is kind of the norm of the assignment as opposed to an option of the assignment makes me feel like, oh my goodness, there are lots of places to fall into a hole, and not a very good hole, right? And then the hole just keeps getting a little bit deeper and deeper. So I think for me, I would first ask, why is it that we are looking at writing stories outside of our perspective instead of reading maybe own voices stories, discussing those stories, comparing that with our own perspective. So if you read an own voices story that takes place in the summer, your summer experience, and then talking about how those two correlate or something like that. But for me, to start off telling somebody that they need to do X, Y, and Z, just gives me a lot of pause, and somebody else can chime in. And so I can't really get past that part in my answer. I'm sorry.
No, I agree completely. That was my first question, was why. I'm trying to figure out what the what the benefit of that assignment could be, having students write outside. And if the purpose is to explore empathy, then I think there are ways, and I go back to Leah, as you're saying, do no harm. You know, asking students to write outside of their cultural experience, that's just a recipe for harm. That is a petri dish of harm. Right? So if we're asking students to explore empathy, there are other ways, I think, less confrontational ways to do that.
I think we are out of time. Thank you all. I know we could go on all night, but thanks for being here. Thanks to our audience. We have 3 more Summer Words panels. There's a link in the chat to register for those. Tomorrow night, we have Thursday night, and then next Monday night. Thank you all again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Ew.
Great to meet you all.
You too. Thanks,
Yeah.
Aaron.
Really enjoyed it.